It's a privilege and an honor to be amongst women who don't just think of power as empowerment, which is the slogan these days. Empowerment is always about somebody else empowering you. But power is not usually given away. Power is usually taken. Glass ceilings are broken glass ceilings are also gently slid aside or walked around or avoided. And most of you, almost all of you, in the position that you're in here, have done exactly that. Now, I think that it is fundamental for women to be leading in all fields. But across the law, our courts, the corporate world, but even NGOs and the media, which are perceived to have more women, at the topmost echelons, you usually have straight, able-bodied, upper caste, Hindu men, right? Now, diversity has happily become a bit of a catchphrase. There are more women directors. I mean, you have the token woman director on every board. But how do we make sure that women have actual power? And why is that important? For better or for worse, the corporate world is where a lot of decisions happen. Transnationally, nationally, even at the smaller micro level. Now, it is in the interests of women not only to lead here, but also to shape what it looks like. First, why? I mean, I think it's obvious why. If you look, for example, at the Bhopal gas tragedy, today is the 36th anniversary of the gas disaster. It wasn't a tragedy, actually, it was a disaster because there was huge corporate negligence in not only stripping the plant down to its bare bones so that because to save money because it was going to be sold off, the safety mechanisms were also stripped down, and the regulatory mechanisms were not functioning adequately. But also after the disaster, we see a number of ways in which there was corporate manipulation of government by limiting damages for even very serious long-term injuries to no more than 25,000 rupees. Now, this is the largest industrial disaster in the world, right? A huge number of those suffering are women. Leela Bai, who I met in Bhopal, had her grandchild lying on the floor, and he was about 11, and I said, why isn't he in school? And she said, well, actually, he's about 24. His mother died in the disaster. He doesn't have any other family. I'm now elderly. I'm affected by the gas leak, and I am somehow supporting him. I'm not saying that if there were women in charge, that the result would necessarily have been different. But I hope that perhaps it might have been. What I am saying, though, is that to this day, we see a serious lack of will in government and across the corporate world to have corporate accountability in these ways. On the other hand, for consumers, and we are all consumers in addition to being actors in the corporate world, you also have the pink tax. So if you have a razor that is a pink and is being marketed to women, and if you have a razor that's blue or black and is being marketed to men, the pink razor tends across companies to be significantly more expensive. This is also true of other women's products across the board, and this kind of discrimination is, when you discover it's startling, but when you go beyond the discovery, you realize how deeply entrenched it is. When cars were designed, they were designed for men. When other products are innovated, they were primarily innovated with men in mind. When you have artificial intelligence being innovated, when you have algorithms being designed, very frequently they are by the most mainstream man of the particular country. The reason that all of this needs to be diversified is because the world is diverse, right? But I also think that in all of this, diversity, even where there's a good-hearted effort, tends to come in at the bottom layer. At the top layer, at the level of real power, there tends to be, it tends to somehow stop. Now, let's come first to the micro level, the level of the company. How can we take decisions that are more favorable to everyone concerned, including women? The law requires, under the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act of 2013, a particular, quite useful structure to prevent and address and penalize sexual harassment. In a number of companies in the organized sector, it is, and companies are in the organized sector, it's taken now a lot more seriously. So a lot of companies now have a policy, and they have an internal complaints committee to prevent, to address how it's going to work if somebody is in fact sexually harassed. So the policy can be a deterrent in and of itself, so it rarely is if the ICC has never taken any action. However, Section 19 also requires workshops. Now, I actually take out the time to conduct some of these workshops. And the reason I do this is because I see something of a transformation, a brightening of eyes in the people who participate. We don't call them training sessions because they're not. The change only happens if people participate, and they're designed to get people to participate. Now, what we do, and you can replicate this in your own company, what we do is we design the workshop so that initially the groups are divided into men and women, and the men talk about how gender has affected them, and the women talk about how gender has affected them. Right? The women tend to have thought about it a lot more. The men tend to have thought about it in terms of how it's affected women, not how it's affected them. So those conversations come out with a lot more that is new. Now, I think that it's really important to ensure that both groups listen very carefully to each other. And that is the beginning. We then have the example of Kamla Harris, who's now the vice president-elect of the United States. Obama made a comment about her 5 or 6 years ago, and he said that not only is she the most brilliant attorney general, she's also the most attractive. Now, there was a huge controversy about that on Twitter. And what happened was that some people were saying that, look, he also said she's brilliant, he's a good friend of hers, why is this a big deal? And then there were others saying, and I thought, well, there's a point to that. On the other hand, there were people saying that, why would you comment on her looks, right? So I ended up doing some research and found that whether it's a politician, whether it's a politician or whether it's a corporate leader, you're less likely to be elected or promoted if your looks are commented on. Secondly, you're less likely to get as big a raise as somebody whose looks are not commented on. Now, whether it's positive or negative. So there are people who speak of particular female politicians in India and say, oh, but she's so ugly, right? Or, oh, she's so attractive. And apparently, interestingly, it was both. So I think that once we go into like these very slight examples and how they can hugely affect people's careers, and make it clear that, look, women are not here to get your compliments, however well intentioned they may be. They're here to work, they're here to do well, they're here to, make meaning out of their jobs, and they're here to make money. So I think that and we go through that, and once a lot of those principles are understood, then we go through communications exercises to ensure that when something like this happens, at the first instance, that perhaps you're equipped to discuss this with your colleague, and it creates an atmosphere of respect and trust. And then, of course, there's a policy which most companies do have, and then we have the ICT. However, keep in mind that if you say that somebody is, oh baby, you're so hot, right? That can be dealt with under the sexual harassment policy. What can't be dealt with is, now under the classic anti-sexual harassment policy, is the manager yelling at his employee, at his junior, and saying that you're a woman and you're so rubbish at your work, right? Or doing this in another work environment, in a third-party work environment, which I think with smaller startups and stuff becomes more relevant, because when there is a big corporate that you're dealing with and somebody is discriminating against you because you're a woman and say it's your startup, right? If it was sexual harassment, this would be actionable in the company. If that's discrimination, then it's not. One of the things that we've been working on, including with Penguin Random House, a number of other very large companies that are ahead of the curve, is making these policies about non-discrimination across the board. Keeping in mind that non-discrimination is not just about not discriminating on the basis of gender, it's also about not discriminating on the basis of caste. So you can't discriminate against a Dalit woman, and your discrimination against her might be because she's Dalit and because she's a woman, right? Or a woman from the Northeast, because you're making particular comments about the freedom with which she might conduct herself, or Muslim woman. So I think this intersectionality is very important to address, and we have addressed it in a large number of these policies as well. Now, what's interesting is that people sometimes talk about merit when they talk about promotion to the highest levels. But if you're ending up with only, again, upper caste Hindu, able-bodied straight men, do you really think that you're getting the best merit from the women, queer people, the trans people, the Dalits, the Muslims, the Christians, other religions, people that you are not recruiting? What's happening is that there is in effect a reservation for this very tiny sliver of men that is currently in force across the board. And it's this reservation that is sometimes called the glass ceiling. And it is this reservation that has to be broken, whether it is by affirmative action, whether it is by goals, by saying that, look, by the end of 2 years, I'm going to make sure that I look carefully and find that in my topmost leadership, I'm going to have 50 to 60% women, and make sure that they're not just women who look like us, women who are, privileged and or relatively privileged. And again, those markers of identity privilege that I just spoke of. In addition, Germany has a very useful policy. They make salaries transparent. And when you make salaries transparent, very frequently the discrimination becomes really apparent, right? When two people doing the same job are not getting paid the same, because the perception is that the woman's salary is perhaps deserved, but it's an extra. It's that extra salary that is not really necessary for to run the house, right? And that's something that has worked quite well in the corporate world there. Now, this is at the micro level in-house in the company. In representation, sometimes there is discrimination. when women are to go outside of the company. Um, there was a situation in the United States where they were discussing whether their Secretary of State at the time, who was a woman, should be sent to Iran, um, which I found deeply, deeply ridiculous, right? Because it's for people to deal with the fact that, you know, and there is nothing that speaks power like power. And ultimately, she was sent. She was sent, and she negotiated whatever she's negotiating. To say, therefore, that we're not going to send a woman because the outside situation is patriarchal is always, I think, a fig leaf, and I think it needs to be reasoned through, because that in itself is a kind of discrimination. When you're on a panel, everyone saw Kamla Harris saying, "I'm speaking," right? Women are interrupted much more than others, and even gay men if they are cisgender, right? And I think it's very important to occupy your space, hold the field, make sure that you are taking the time you need to say what you need to and what you wish to, and taking credit where credit is due, and sharing credit where credit is due. Both things, right? Um, Ultimately, I think at this sort of micro to meso level, let's not forget to let our lights shine, because sometimes we try to fit into the kind of shoes that we think we're filling. But always remember that you are in this world to contribute what you uniquely bring, and your experiences and your creativity and everything, every bit of who you are. I used to separate my personal self and my work self to a very significant extent, particularly in the courtroom when I was much younger. So the look was always very cut and dried, speech was very cut and dried. Um, Only rationality and logic was used. So there were times I think that I didn't use my facts and what the judge might feel, you know, emotions to their best advantage. I find that now I really do bring my whole self, well, much more of my whole self, into the workplace, into the public sphere, but also into the courtroom. And I find that I'm a much better lawyer for it. I'm a different lawyer from all the, all the men that came before me. Um, and also not identical to the women who have come before me at all. But I really do think that I'm a better lawyer. I'm happier at work, um, and some cases may have fallen by the wayside, but far more cases and far more interesting work, and true inspiration from within myself, connecting it to the work I do, has, even in corporate litigation and commercial litigation, has come and brought me where I am sitting today. Now, coming to the macro level, and I think this is important. We have a situation where electoral bonds are financing politics. Now, electoral bonds are primarily bought by the by corporates, and including by foreign corporates after the finance bill was amended. Now, this means that across the board, you have large corporates either donating because they wish to or because they are being forced to, because otherwise they will fall by the wayside and they won't be able to get clearances on their licenses or whatever other dues that whatever else is actually due to them. trouble with this is that smaller companies fall by the wayside then, because you have the larger companies being benefited. This case hasn't been heard by the Supreme Court for a long, long time. These laws tend to come up around elections. Around 90% of the money goes to the BJP. The Congress will not oppose this bill either. And some of the money also goes to the Congress, but about 90% goes to the BJP. Now, why should you care? A large number of smaller companies, as I was saying, are owned by women, right? And to have an even playing field, to have transparency, to make sure that the mind, the very environment, the land is not being sold off, not to the highest bidder, but to an auction that you could never even be a part of, is, I think, something that is quite fundamental, and I think something that is facing the corporate world today that is not being spoken of in the corporate world. It's being spoken of in constitutional terms. It's being spoken of in legal circles, but it's not being spoken of in the corporate world. And I think it is important for the corporate world to be examining this. Ultimately, I think that finding our passions and tapping into our inspirations in our work life is everything. And once we find that, a lot of other things fall into place. We've realized, I think, our generation, that we rise and fall to some extent together. It's not one woman, there's not just a place for one woman at the table. So it's not just like everyone, like the generation before us, is backbiting and, well, not all of you stand on the shoulders of giants, let me first acknowledge that. And they had it much harder than us. But I think now there isn't as much of that backbiting and sniping and, for that one place at the table. I think that there's a recognition that at the very least, half the table, and the head of the table perhaps, should be occupied by a woman. And so if there are 2 women there now, it makes the board more used to the fact that there will be women, and it increases other women's chances of getting there.